Good evening, everybody, members and guests, and our presenter Jason, and our board member. Okay, I will firstly share my screen, and we will start. Okay. First of all, I'm Christine, the President of Board of Directors of AAM. And some technical things before we start, I would like to remind that tonight's seminar will be conducted in 2 languages, English and Chinese. So you can actually choose your language anytime in the interpretation button. So you can see it is on the iPad screen, it's the top right button, there's a more. So you can choose your English and Chinese. If it's a desktop, it's the image on the right. And it is best to mute the original audios so you don't hear the 2 languages at the same time. Okay, and then we also have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so you can start typing any questions in the Q&A button. Okay, so tonight's seminar will be a continuation on our urban planning series, and I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Jason Hilgefort. Jason will discuss concept from urban design to public space, down to community informal spaces. And currently with the Macau, there's ongoing public space enhancement, so I'm sure tonight's presentation will be very inspiring. So a little introduction of Jason. He's the founding partner at Land+Civilization Compositions. He's also an urbanist architect who currently is a lecturer at HKU faculty of architecture, and academic director of a formal academy. He's also a regular writer, contributing to a sort of publications, including volumes, architecture reviews, dramas, AD, more and more and more. And with his extensive experience in urban design, where he now has an office in Hong Kong and projects in the Greater Bay Area, he will present to us the topic of from formal urbanism to informal spatial practice, where he will references urban development in Shenzhen, parks in Dongguan, community engagement works in Hong Kong, and research project in East Asia, reflecting on the role of heritage, ideas of nature, grid network, emergent infrastructure, and ideas of development urban export model. Sounds all very interesting. And I need to introduce our board panel today, where we have Donna, our vice president, and also Jimmy, our director of our board as well. And furthermore, to thank you, Jason, for your presentation for tonight, we would like to present you the certificate of appreciation. We will send you the hard copy to your faculty. And now, shall we begin, Jason? Can I hand over to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to share screen and take over here. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
So first, hold on. There we go. So first, let me say thanks for the invitation. Someone who's been in the Greater Bay Area for 5 years. It's nice to start to get to know more and more about this region. As said in the introduction, I'm based mostly in Hong Kong now and do a lot of work in Shenzhen. It's nice to be a part of Macau. I've been there a few times. I've lectured there at St. Joe's, but it's always nice to virtually go to Hong Kong. So thanks again very much for the invitation. So with that, I'll start sharing kind of my thoughts and ideas that come through our practice. And so I've kind of structured this presentation to break up a series of our works, focusing mostly on urban design and public space, and not as much on our architecture or research projects, and broken them up into 4 components, which I'll walk you through as we go. This idea of how detailing or kind of making things really relates to culture, the notion of frameworks and regulations, and how they relate to how we design, the idea that nature is maybe not so natural, and maybe is a bit fake in some ways, and then last talking about ideas of systems, ideas of networks, infrastructures, and small-scale technologies. But as a start, I'll start with this image here. You can probably tell by my accent, well, if you're listening on the Chinese
从
channel,
我的口音可以听出来，
Sorry, I don't speak Mandarin.
我是美国人，但是如果你们收听
town,
中文频道，
in the
很可
middle of the
惜你们
United
可能
States,
听不到我的声
originally.
音。
And
那
so
我
one
来
of these
自美
towns in
国，
this space here, which you can see it's part
我
of the
是来
American
到
grid.
我是
You
在
can see some traces
这片
of
区域的一
ecology
个
and
很小的
natural
地方，
systems. So even in a
在那
rural
里
place
土
like
生
this,
土长的美
these
国人。
ideas are still there. And were ever present, even though I wasn't aware, maybe when I was a young child. But the reason the town exists actually is because of a
那么我是
manipulation
来
of
自
nature
一个
and
小
a
城镇的
notion of
美国人，
infrastructure. A canal
而
was built
这
to
个地
connect what is
区也
basically the
是
Mississippi
依
River
照我们
to
当
one of
时
the
的一个
Great
运
Lakes
河而
in
建
the
的。
United States, and my town sat along that canal.
我们的
Further,
城
my
镇就
town,
在
this
那
is
个
Ohio,
运
it's
河
kind
旁
of
边。
one of the little dots within that grid.
来
Was
自
part
俄
of the
亥俄
layout
州，
of the
我
American
生
grid
长
that
我
swept
生长的
across
地方就处在这种
from the
美
kind
国
of
典
middle
型的
east
方沟
of
保
the
护
U.S.
区域，
Going
是
west.
在
And so that grid,
这种
that
区域从
regulation,
美
that
国的中
system
东
to
地区
divide
直横
land,
跨
defined
美
the way I
国，
saw
也
spaces
是
and the
当
way I
时的政
experienced
策导
my
向，
very
使得
rural
我们形成了
hometown.
这种方格形
And
的道路
further to
布局。
that, where I grew up
我生长的
used
地
to
方
be a space for Indians or Native
曾
Americans
经是有很
prior
多的
to
印第
us
安人，
white Europeans
在
arriving
我
and
们白种
let's
美
politely
欧洲
say
人到
removing
达
them.
这达这片土
But
地之
then the
前，是
legacy
他
of
们
that still
在这
remained
片
in
土地
this
上
rural
生活。
place when the farmers, because where I grew up
所
was
以
mostly a
我们一
farming
直有这种
space, and
传
I'll come
统，
back to
我们的
rural
农民
issues
在翻耕种
later.
地的时候，
When the
经常会
farmers
找
would
到
turn
这
over
种
the soil,
古老
we would
的
often find arrowheads or the tips of the
美
point
国
of an
当地的
arrow
这种建
in
筑，
these farms still 100 years later after these battles. So this notion of
就在这
materiality
100
of
多年
stone
后，还
being a
是
part
会
of
有这种
culture
建
is
筑埋
something
在
that's
土地里，
been
这
around
也
me
是
for a
文
while.
化能够留下的一些印记。
With that, I'll talk about our design practice that we have,
那下面呢，我也会和大
LCC,
家
Land
交
and
流一下我的
Civilization
设计
Compositions.
实
We
践。
started it in the
我
Netherlands, but
开
we are
发
very
了
much
这
based here
家
now in Hong Kong
LCC
and
公
Shenzhen.
司，现在是在
Throughout the presentation, you'll probably
香港。
notice I don't say I so much, I will say we.
如果你听我的介绍，可以听到我用了很多“我们”这个词，因为不仅仅是我创办了这家公司，我和我的合作伙伴一起创办了这家公司。我是这张照片里的金发男士，旁边这位女士就是我的伙伴。 和其他的一些工作室一样，我们起初写了很多的文章，而且我们和其他的一些设计师一起合作，参与了很多的项目。大概在12年前，我们在瑞士有了这个想法。 而且对于制度方面也是非常的感兴趣。我们也去了解了很多关于土地上的建筑方面的一些观点。我们和许多政客进行了交流，还拍摄了土耳其城市发展的一些纪录片，去探讨土耳其正在进行的一些再发展。 我们也记录了当地的一些群众的想法。在上次金融危机2008年席卷全球的时候，我们还在鹿特丹的酒吧开展了许多的研讨会和讲座，邀请了我们许多的朋友进行交流，去探讨这个城市发展方面的设计。 我们也讨论了这些实践是如何改变、如何塑造我们的城市的。和许多的初创工作室一样，我们最初写了很多的文章，也参与了很多的文化节。有一次在鹿特丹的文化节，我们想探讨一些鹿特丹的历史。 鹿特丹有这种建筑内部结构的公司，我们便想着可以通过自己的创意设计这种安装装置。这也是我们创造的一些安装装置。
这也是我们用的一些装置和设计的一些和某些设计。我们可以看到这些设计更像是，其实是用我们浆衬衫时用的这种淀粉浆，我们把它做成了这么一种设置，能够完善建筑物的结构。我们也邀请了许多的纤维建设家和设计师参与到整个的设计过程之中。
And so you can see here how we interpreted this kind of industrial space, these archways, and how these archways read. So this is just a standard fabric and made structural, and kind of trying to understand relating to history, relating to materiality, but really relating to the contemporary culture, and trying to link those in a very simple, a very cheap installation, to be honest.
这些装置并不是非常的昂贵。那接下来我们也来讨论一下这4个不同的不同的点。
theoretical or conceptual. I'll talk about that a bit fast, and then I'll talk about a project that we have here in the Greater Bay Area that's usually larger scale and public space project. In some ways, how we think those ideas relate. And I'll also talk about some past projects I did before we started our office. For example, before moving to Rotterdam, before moving to Hong Kong, I lived in Mumbai in India and worked at an architecture practice there, Rahul Malhotra. In case anyone knows who he is, he used to be the head of urban design at Harvard. I was lucky to work with him, and we had a client that wanted a new office building with a green facade. We found a way to do that pretty cheaply and efficiently, to set up that sort of green appearance that they wanted in relation.
我们为他们设计了这种他们所想要的绿色的正立面设计，并且呢，在这个过程中，我们也注意到了印度的贫富差距还是比较明显的。但是对于当地人来讲，这种贫富差距他们很可能会被忽略，所以我们就想创造出这种结构，能够让在这里面工作的富人注意到这些贫富差距，并且通过细节把这种文化展现出来。也会把一些经济方面的差距展现到这个设计之中。
The big first project we won here in the Greater Bay Area was in
那下面我们来分享一个我们在粤港澳大湾区的进行的一个案例是在光明的体育公园。
To Guangzhou, it's kind of the second stop after you leave Futian in Shenzhen. So along that place, there's actually an existing nature area.
我们可以看到这个区域其实是一个自然区域，但是政府希望能够继续升级这个区域。他们有2点要求，第一点是希望能够让它自然化，第二点是尽可能运用体育的概念。当然，我们也提到过，想把它建造成深圳的一个绿色网络的一部分。而且我们考虑了如何把它和当地的实际进行结合。我们看到这东部的地区可能会有很多的山区，西部可能更为平坦。这对于我们来讲，设计可能会比较困难，因为我们需要把2种的地区实际进行结合。在山区的部分，不同的地形、景观、不同的鸟类和不同的植物，都给我们带来了挑战。我们如何把这些实际进行一个结合，进行统一？我的想法是。
Let's create a long ramp going from the top to the bottom.
我们就建造一个非常长的栈桥。然后最初我只是开玩笑似的提出这个理念，后来我想着可以把它变为实际。这样呢，通过这个栈桥这种高架的行人道，人们可以非常舒服地穿越整个区域。就如这个图中展示的红色的道路，
这里呢会有意的设计几个大弯，那人们就可以更多的和自然进入一个深刻的了解、深刻的接触。我们也可以通过这种虹桥的设计，充分的考虑地形连接点和大自然，比如说鸟类的关系。那其他的地方，我们也可以有意的把它和体育和游乐区进行一个连接。
And you can see here how it comes out on the more western end into a much more urban situation.
那我们可以在这张图上看到，我们从一个更城市化的地区到一个更生态化的地区，这也是我们提到的一个体育场的一个建设。提到了体育。
Sports became a very interesting topic for us actually.
体育呢，也是对于我们来讲非常重要的一个概念。人们不仅仅是进行篮球训练啊、乒乓球训练啊，体育场也是一个非常现代化的场馆。当我们考虑到体育的时候，我们也可以去考虑体育是如何在我们现代化社会存在的。我们一般会把它固化成某种特殊的球类，就比如足球啊、篮球啊、乒乓球啊这些球类。但事实上，体育也是一个创新中心。比如说，体育的足球的技巧啊，就比如说不同地区可能会有不同的球类、不同的体育形式的出现。那么我们就可以看到体育这方面的不同的创新。我们也想拥抱这种生态系统，以及针对中国的这个现实。因为在中国大陆很多情况下，一些篮球场都会被其他人占用。就比如特别早的时候，可能会有人在那里打太极。那下午的时候，很多的年轻人、很多的小孩会到这个体育场玩耍。这就要求我们对这个体育场设计多种不同的利用方式，去进行不同的功用。所以呢，我们就设计了这种不同形状的体育场，这样也可以把它们作为成当地的一个非常标志性的象征，也会让它体育场的互动性更强。正如我提到的，这个球类方面、体育方面的这个创新。这一点就回到我们刚才提到的细节和文化，特别是对于人们在深圳的人们来讲，他们是被创新围绕着的。体育就是创新的一个点，但生态也是我们可以和创新连接到一起的。我们可以把体育和科技联系起来，这样我们就可以把生态和创新联系到一起。所以我们也在这个公园内部进行了一些研究。我们可以让这个公园成为一些科学家呀，或者对此感兴趣的人们进行研究的地区，便把这个，也就是把这个公园建设成人们能够进行实验、能够进行研究的地区。
The R&D center next to the sports center, more pool-based.
就在体育馆旁边，我们就有一个研发中心。
But further than that, if you know about parks aren't usually
公园比较了解。一般情况下，公园也就是一个地区，固定不动的。但是它们也会不断的进化。它们进化的原因是因为它们是一个非常自然的生态环境。公园内部的生态是确实很好看，但是我们可能也会需要有一些创新和变化。我们的创意中的一点就是在公园之间建立这个苗圃。普通意义上的苗圃，也就是你能够一个地方，你来到这里可以选择自己喜欢的花草或者树木，而我们这个设计的中心就是能够在这个公园内部建立起一个苗圃，
topography and differing levels.
那么我们利
We
用
can
公园
create
内部的
different
不同地
places
形
to plant different trees and different
去种植
species
不
that
同
could
的
stay
树
there,
木，
but some of those species would
它们
move
可
to
能会
other
一直的
places.
存在。
So as you can see in
过
some
几
of the
年之后，
gridded
我们再把合
forms
适的
within
树
this
木移
image
植
here
到
from the
其他
air,
公园其
at
他的地
nursery
区。
would maybe grow a tree for 5 years, and then later that tree would be moved to
那么这
another
么
part of
苗
the
圃
park
可
to
能
add to the
这
biodiversity
个
of the
树在
park.
前5年
So
就
we
在
wanted to celebrate
公园的这个
these
地方，
systems,
但
these
过几年
realities
就
of the
被移
park
植到了
within
其
the
他的地
design
方。
itself. And an
这个
image
就
here
是我
again of
们
some
能
of
够把
these
生
sports
态利
fields
用到
in
公园
animation.
建设里的一个
And
创
then
意。
an image of, the phase 1 of the park, mostly to the west, will be open,
那么
I
我们
believe,
西区
next
的第一
month
阶段已
in
经完
Shenzhen.
成，
So the
应该
red
可以
path, as
在
it's
9
been
月
called,
份
is
可以对外开放。
shown here. Moving on to the next phase, this
下
idea of
一步
frameworks
呢，我们来讨论一下系统的概念。
and how there's these regulations,
构
rules
架
by government,
也就是这
rules in terms
些
of finance and
法
funding that
律
we
啊
as
和经济
designers
方面的一
often don't
些
think about too
发
much in
展
our
如何
designs.
去影响我们的城市建设。
When I first
我第一
came, or
次
we first came to
来
Shenzhen, it was via the
深
UABB,
圳
the
是来参
Shenzhen
加
Architecture Event,
UABB，
the
也就
Shenzhen
是
Biennale.
深港
We
双
were part
城
of
双
that
年
and
展
asked to be a part of the
我们
curatorial
当
team
时呢是
and to
要
lead the
运
educational
营一
platform,
个教育
which we
平
call the
台，
A-Formal
这个
Academy.
教育平台叫做 A4M
When we
Academy。
were based in Shenzhen, we did a number of
我
things
们当时
with
在
the
深圳
A-Formal
呢，我们做
Academy,
了很多
including
事情，
collaborations with
包
craftsmen
括
where we
运
made
营教育
installations.
平台，我们还做
We
了很多
did
的装置。
pavilions. This is close to the Shoko port,
这
the
个
ferry
地点
terminal.
是
Some
在
people
蛇
might
口
take
的
there at
渡轮
times.
码头。
That was then under construction. This was again 5 years ago.
现
And
在
so
这
we
个是
we
5
played
年
around with
前，
that,
当
but
时
we
还在
also
建设当
produced
中。
a book,
我们
some
当
of
时
our
还写了一本
findings and
书，
experiences. And part of the
说
research we
介绍
did
了
as
我
part of
们
that
的
was
发现
looking
和
at this
经验。
idea of borders within the
谈
Greater
到
Bay
设计
Area
原则或
and
框
the
架呢，就
history
要
of
谈到
that.
边境这个问
A place like
题。
Shenzhen has become very iconic
像
as being
深
related with
圳
the
呢，
special economic zone.
我
And
们
that
人常说是经
typology
济特
for
区，
economic development has been
是高
repeated
科
all over the
技
world.
的
There's now
地
special
区，
economic zones in Africa, in the United States, in
在
Europe.
非洲、
They're
美
everywhere. It was
国、
such a
欧
successful example.
洲，
But for us,
这都
we
是
think it's
深圳都是一个很
unfortunate
好的
that not enough people are talking about that idea of manipulation of borders, creating
人们
special
经常
zones is
谈
actually
论边
a
界
tradition
控
that
制
has
的问
existed in the
题。
Greater Bay Area and continues.
边界
You
问
can see it
题
on
不
the
仅存
interface
在
here.
大
This
湾
is
区当
the
中，
Macau Loop, which is a new
您还可以看一
development
下
that
落马洲
that
河
is
套
now
地
breaking
区，
ground in
现
Hong
在
Kong
正
and
在
is basically
开
blurring the
发当
border
中。
between Hong Kong and
这
Shenzhen.
也是
I'll speak a bit
香港
about the area
和
to the
深
west of this
圳
later, and I'll speak
区
about
域在不
another
断
area
模
coming
糊的一
up.
个例子。
But if you trace back, this didn't start with a
历
special
史上
economic
呢，
zone. This started in
这
many
个
ways with
经济特
colonialism
区
and the British
还有香港的
claiming,
边界
taking,
也在
however
一
you
直
want to
变
say
化，
it,
因为当时有英国的殖民者。
stealing, if you want, Hong Kong Island, and how that was setting up its own special economic zone, this interface between the British
还有
Empire
在
and
香
the
港
Chinese
和
Empire.
深
But
圳
if you look even
在
further, in some
那时候
ways, it
边
was
界
even
在不断
before
的
that
变
or
化。
related. In China, there were many
但是不
concessions,
仅
as they were
仅是
called.
在香
This
港，中国
example
内
is
地
in
对边界
Wuhan,
的
or
看
then called
法也在
Hong
不
Kong.
断的变化。
But
比
even
如说
within
武汉
Wuhan,
过
these
去
concessions you can see, of course, in
是三个
Shanghai,
城
the French
市，其中
concession
包
is a
括了
well-known
汉口，其中
leftover of this.
中国当时
But
还
in
有
a
很
place
多
like
割
Wuhan,
地
you
啊，
could
还
see
有
a part
租
of
界。
a Russian city, a part of
在
a
武
French
汉，你
city,
也可以
a
看
part of a
到
Spanish city, all within a few blocks
法
of
租
each other,
界
and
啊，
that
还
legacy
有俄罗
existed.
斯人。
But the notion of creating a manipulation of borders, a blurring of borders,
所
is something
以
that has
边界的
existed
看法呢，也
in
是
this
在不
part of the
断
world
变
for a
化。
long, long time. And so
然
you
后
can
这
see
个
in this
边界的
graphic
问
here
题
we
也存在
created,
了很久。
that's Hong Kong Island at the bottom, and then moving up you can
所
see
以
when the
看这
border
个图，
expanded to include Kowloon, where I'm sitting right now, and then how
大
that
湾区
also
最刚开
later
始
started to include the
包
new
含香港，到
territories.
现在
And
把
then in
有
time, that border shifted
边
even
界
more oddly in terms of creating the
深
special
圳
economic
的
zone.
经济
And
特
now you
区
could
也
argue
包
even
含
the
这
entire
个
Greater Bay Area itself is a part of this expanding and shifting series of borders. And of course, Macau itself is obviously one of the many examples in the Greater Bay Area of this play of border realities and how it's used to manipulate and create economic difference and to create exchanges. So this was something that was intriguing to us. Shifting back to design, our office, and again, this was in collaboration. We do this competition I'll show now with an office called Lola Landscape Architects and an office called Taller Architects. Lola is Dutch, Taller is out of Colombia, Bogota. So we were asked to do this competition in Shanghai. Shanghai is in western Shenzhen, south of the airport in Bao'an, and west of Nanshan, or northwest of Shaozhou. It's a new area of the city. You can see here images of it under construction. A lot of things happen very fast in Shenzhen and mainland, but Shanghai is moving very fast, as it is, again, this blurry example of the mixing of kind of Hong Kong financial center and Shenzhen tech, as it was initially pitched 10 years ago. So rapidly, skyscrapers, neighborhoods are coming out of the ground. We were asked to actually just do a small part of a much larger vision that was done by an office called Field Operations. They did the initial master plan. And there's many projects within the site, so this is just a component. But we were asked to look at the linear public spaces that were initially envisioned in the master plan and figure out how to actually make those work. So this is a very complex urban design project. I'll now just talk about a small component of it. And so for us, thinking about these linear spaces, there were a few key ideas. And one was the celebrating of ecology and the diversity of the Greater Bay Area. So how could we take some of the very special planting realities and natural realities that exist in the Greater Bay Area and bring them into Shanghai? And then also, Shanghai being a very, very urban area with skyscrapers, but also with a great deal of infrastructure underneath and bridges. I'll show more of this later. How could we take that idea of nature and use it to connect the lower spaces of maybe infrastructure or underground and use it to kind of link? So when you're not underground, you don't just feel underground, you feel connected with the natural world, and that above in the natural world comes down. And also the infrastructure comes up. So in trying to do this, thinking about these biotopes or habitats of plants, you have to start being aware, of course, of the heat around buildings and how wind moves. I won't get into that too much. But we had to get realistic about which sort of plant habitats could actually exist in these very narrow spaces, in these very intense areas in a very urban condition. We started to set up key biotopes or natural habitats within the area that could work. And we started to define each part of these linear sites with those habitats. Now, we think of the natural habitats, and you can see some of the images here overall. But of course, it's nice to have a wetland, but of course, it's an urban area. You still need things like play fields for children. You need places for people who are working in the area to maybe have lunch. You need places for performance. How do you fit those in with those natural habitats? We had to find that balance as part of the project. So you can see in some of the images now, we wanted to have this contrast of what felt like a pretty intensely natural area that maybe you wouldn't expect to see in the city, in contrast with this highly urbanized area, but still to have moments like this that really you could feel almost like you're, let's say, in the jungle or on a hike within 100 meters of an office tower door. How we could have those moments mixed together. And if you were to walk along these linear spaces, you could feel like you're in a pretty urban area to a very natural area and transition slowly between the two. You also embrace, let's say, more contemporary design ideas and celebrate those as well. Further on that idea, because of the movement of cars in the area, of course, roads are necessary. But of course, we wanted to connect these natural habitats and walking areas with a series of bridges. But we didn't want the bridges to just be architectural gestures or forms. We wanted them to link to these natural systems. So you see in other, maybe more natural conditions, you'll see animal crossings on bridges like this. We wanted these to be kind of human crossings, but also still quite friendly in terms of animal and plant and human crossing as well. But then coming now, and I won't get too much into the underground reality of this project, but there's high-speed train stations, MTR stations, a lot, parking underground, retail underground, community spaces underground. It's really quite a layered city. So how do we deal with that underground infrastructural reality and bring a sense of nature, whatever that means, into the area? And so we talked very simply, as you can see with these initial models for the competition, about how we could try and fold the nature down and kind of pull the infrastructure up to create a connection from up to down. We're seeing an image like this that's envisioned as a gym or a retail space to the right. It's actually a bridge rising to the left, and this transition. So also when you're underground, you get some natural daylight and a connection with the outside world. You can start to see in details here as we go forward in more smaller moments, just to allow, as you circulate down from above, the nature to kind of be that link between those two spaces. Or even in more of a traditional play space, a gym, here you can see in tennis to have natural daylight, but still the ability to see some nature outside, and when you're walking by to also see down into the space as well, to create these layers and connections. Or even just an area that there is no natural daylight, how we can start to think of how to allow nature to exist in that underground area. And then in the largest underground area, as you can see here, the main kind of train station, you can see we talked about the importance of the ability at all times to see out to the end of the tunnel. But then we also talked about the potential of the tunnel as a temporary public space. I mean, it's always a public space. In an area that's being built as rapidly as this, the reality is the people that will live there in 15 years aren't there yet, but the infrastructure is. So we talked about the potential to use this as a civic space or a cultural space in the meantime to try out different programs, where it's to bring in the Biennale, maybe a temporary basketball court, maybe a fashion show could happen in this large infrastructure early on, whereas maybe 15 years from now, this train station will be teeming and filled with people. So moving on to the third step in my presentation is this idea of nature. And something I start to question more and more as we do more and more landscape architecture and public space work in our projects. It's something we think about. But relating back, again, I worked in India, as I mentioned, for Rahul. One of the projects I was honored to be a part of was we designed an elephant village. It's in a particular part of India called Ambar. They have a historic fort there. The fort is up on the hill. It's a very big tourist destination because the fort is a beautiful old Indian fort. But at some point, maybe 40 or 50 years ago, someone had the idea, well, let's allow the tourists to ride elephants to go to the top of the hill so they don't get tired in the extreme heat. This was a lovely idea for the tourists, but quite terrible for the elephants. For the elephants, they wouldn't naturally live in this area. It's too hot and dry. So we actually had to completely re-engineer a district away from the fort where the elephants and their families could live together. And so we had to completely fake this habitat for the sake of the elephants to be comfortable, to make their lives decent as well. Because elephants live as long as humans do. So it's actually between an elephant and a family, it's kind of a lifelong relationship, spending your entire life together. Okay, bringing it back a bit more to the greater Bay Area, another kind of speculative project that our office LCC did was when the typhoon hit. I think it was about 2 years ago now. Many trees were knocked down, of course, as it always is. My landscape architecture staff came in really crying about the loss of trees that they saw on the street on their way to work. And we started to discuss what we should think about, because the Hong Kong government was dealing with the trees really as a waste, as something to be thrown away and disposed of. So we started researching what they were really doing. And what they were really doing, the image on the top there, that's Kai Tak, that's the old airport in Hong Kong, which is slated for redevelopment. But during this time, they basically just put huge piles of waste wood on that site, and then ultimately took that waste wood on a ship and put it in a landfill or a garbage dump actually kind of close to Shenzhen, a site we'll talk about in a bit. And so they were just seeing wood as waste, which for us was obviously a missed opportunity. And believing in climate change and the reality that these sort of natural weather occurrences will be occurring more and more, or at least fairly often in this region. This is going to happen another time. There will be more wood, quote, waste in the future. So how could we rethink this system of disposing of this, quote, waste and see it as an opportunity? So we started to talk about how within Hong Kong you could have local hubs where the trees could be gathered. So instead of a singular place in different regions, instead of trucking them or boating them all over the city. And how in those areas you could think about how that wood could be reused, because it could be reused in a number of ways. In a very simple way, of course, you could use it on playgrounds as a place with wood chips to create a nice soft space for kids to play. If you wanted to think a bit more elaborate, which we thought about, you can see the image here. We thought of it could be a part of a large installation of all of Victoria Bay, and thinking of really having a beautiful kind of almost Burning Man like event encompassing the whole area as a visual spectacle. But thinking a bit more practically, a place like Hong Kong is not just an urban place. At the edges, it's actually quite rural. And a lot of, and I'll speak more about this later, the notion of rural or small town will be coming up. These rural spaces actually could use a lot of help. They could use simple boardwalks. They could use community centers. A lot of those people could use the wood to build different pathways. How could we start to use that kind of waste as an opportunity to kind of engage with our communities and help out those maybe on the edges of our city? And this was a part of an installation in Europe on future design thinking or something. But anyway, coming back again to the Greater Bay Area, I'll talk now about Shenzhen Bay. So again, a competition we were invited to, Shenzhen Bay Waterfront Park. And if you know a bit about Shenzhen Bay, this is Shenzhen Bay here. Hong Kong is to the south. Shekou is here to the west. Shenzhen Bay is this whole water body here where the Shenzhen River spills out into the delta. And if you know what it used to be like, this is 1979, and this is what it's like now. So what used to be a series of fishing villages amongst wetlands has been transformed with a lot of infill. And by the way, I assume you can see my cursor. This is Shanghai to the west that I was speaking about. And our site is really this whole park waterfront here, all through Nanshan down to Shekou. So we wanted to look at the history of the site. So yes, it has been changed from something very rural, a series of fishing and kind of nice communities that are in what is now called Shenzhen, places like Baixizhou or Shuiwei or Shaowei, and how that area is transformed. So the old coastline used to be back here, now it's here, and it slowly adapts over time. And a previous park design had been done a few years ago by a landscape office called SWA. But the government wanted a big improvement to this park, as the city of Shenzhen has changed a great deal in the last 12 years. But we wanted to understand this as a history of kind of how nature and man have filled in the bay and created new, quote, natural spaces. And in this simple diagram here, on the top left, you can see this idea that previously these kind of fishing villages really blurred the line between what was water, what was a space for land-based nature, and what was a space for humans. So you can see on the bottom left, this idea that there's really a line for urban, city, a line that is park, green, and a line that is blue. And as you can see on the bottom right, we want to start to blur that line by having connections across that line to allow some, quote, urban or human spaces to be out towards the water, and some of the more natural or water spaces to come back in towards the city. To do this, we need to think about the reality of how the water systems work in Shenzhen Bay now. Because of course, there's a series of rivers that dump in, there's a series of channels, there's a series of even sewage or toilet water that dumps out into the bay. And those create very different ecologies in very different areas. And how could we relate to those and use that as an excuse or a reason to create a much more nutrient-rich, much more interesting series of spaces to see along the waterfront. We also needed to think about the urban connections across. How do pedestrian bridges work? How do underpasses work? How can citizens go from the city out to the water? We then started to set up this idea of how we start to think of this interchange, this interface between the water and the human, and how our interventions could shift that. So first it started with understanding that there's different urban conditions as well, not just natural, within each area. And then we started to talk about a series of interventions that could stick out towards the water itself, and how these public spaces could blur and connect. And those were a series of examples. And let me be clear, this project has been under further design for the last 8 months. It has certainly changed and evolved. I won't be showing that tonight because of obviously reasons of respecting of client. But at that time, we were talking a lot, and most of this still remains, to be honest. But the images are a bit old. But we talked about a series of spaces along the waterfront, from floating farms to maybe a floating forest, and how these, not just spaces for humans, how they would relate to the water spaces underneath. So how they could create different oyster or fish habitats, and how we could start to generate a different series of ecologies along the waterfront that would be much more diverse than the initial natural conditions that maybe existed 1,000 years ago, because of the diversity of water systems and the systems we could set up with these sort of pylons and structures we would be putting in. And so along this whole strip, there would be a real showcase, the type of animal and plant habitat along with urban cases mixed in. So within these natural systems, we would have these more calm moments, simple waterfront walkways, something much more urban as a place to overlook, sports fields, even amphitheaters and culturally performance spaces next to the new Shenzhen Bay super headquarters that's coming, if those of you who may know about that mega project. To maybe just simple swimming pools actually out in the bay so you can feel like you're in the bay swimming. So that, again, was this idea of how we think of nature as something that we can manipulate. Now, that's not something new. We've always known we can manipulate nature.
那我们一直也知道我们可以去掌控自然，也能把它去囊括到我们的整个设计里。
But now I want to shift to the idea of systems. By that I mean more man-made systems.
下面呢，我们会来讨论一下系统。在这里，我们会涉及一些基础设施、网络。 以及智慧城市的一些概念，以及我们如何把这些概念更好的引入到我们的设计之中，这也是我们在系统方面的一个考虑啊。首先呢，我会回顾一下之前我在美国工作的时候，大概是20年以前。 我们就在讨论这个公共交通导向的发展模式。 也就是我们所谓的 TOD 发展模式，还在美国的时候，我们经常去讨论这个概念，因为很多的美国城市其实都是利用基础设施网络，依照这些汽车、地铁的网络而建的。在欧洲啊、香港啊，也有很多这种模式。我们也理解这种城市的交通。 是对日常生活是多么的重要，而我们其中一个项目就是围绕着丹佛的一家酒店去打造一个赖以交通发展的社区模式，更好的发展。那么，我们回到现在，我们在大湾区其实也有一个项目，是香港和深圳共同进行的这种。 项目，当然这也不是我自己 LCC 完成的，我们和 MLA 加和 AAA 一起合作，我们共同完成整个的设计。其实我们也是在比赛中拿到的这个项目。
between Shenzhen and Hong Kong, and obviously submitting this sort of design with what's been happening in the last year between Hong Kong and Shenzhen was about borders, about these issues, and about these realities. So we had to think about what this area meant as an interface of Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and how it could be a connection between these two cities, not just for the movement of people, but for much more. So then we wanted to talk about the port, one, understanding a bit of the history and what it meant. When the Huanggang port was initially built, it was of course done with the idea mostly of goods coming into the Hong Kong port and entering mainland China, and it was about the movement of goods usually through trucks. But now it is mostly used when the virus isn't going on. I use it to cross the border very often, but it's often now more of a human crossing at Guangdong or Macau, as it's called on the Hong Kong side. But moving forward, this is seen as a different potential. One, the trucks and cars will become much, much less. The human movement will become much, much more prominent, and they really want to connect the two sides together in kind of an innovation center to benefit both Shenzhen and Hong Kong. And we wanted to think about that. Now, when the client said what they're looking for, they truly wanted an innovation center for space for R&D, research and development, technology and innovation. As you can see, some of the ideas here. Homes for medical tech, robotics, finance technology, these sort of things is what they want. So when you start to think about these ideas, what does that really mean? Before I was talking about infrastructure in these systems, but when you start to think at a neighborhood scale, it also is very relevant today. You have to start thinking about things like smart waste and logistics, district cooling and heating systems, how to take care of rainwater and wastewater on site, and how do you deal with all these high-tech systems we have now in cities that are possible to make our cities more sustainable and efficient. How do you do that and still create a decent, natural, lovely urban living environment? But beyond that, in an area like Hong Kong, you have to deal with the people movement. And how they're moving through the site. Some people are just moving through the site to go to another part of Shenzhen or Hong Kong. Some people are entering the site. How to deal with these people flows was another large question. And these series of infrastructure hubs that existed in the area. How do they move? How do they enter the site? How do we manage that in terms of it still being a border crossing, whereas in the future it won't be a border? These sort of ideas. You can see trying to take those moments at the bottom there, you can see that would be one of the main entrances from Hong Kong into Shenzhen, and how to make that a space that opens up and is inviting, looks back to Hong Kong and opens up the area. So how do you manage these requirements and still create what we think is very nice urban space? Then there's the idea of smart technologies, which is much discussed, smart cities and these things, which I'll be discussing more. What are those? How are those put into the city? These become even smaller, from light poles to charging stations to self-driving cars. How could they be incorporated in the area? What does that mean for space? And even, you know, in a place like Shenzhen, especially in a high-tech area, the idea of wellness and taking care of people. And now in the age of Corona or coronavirus, also very relevant. How can you use these technologies to allow people to be more aware of how they can be healthy and have better lives within our cities? And so we wanted to take these technological ideas and give them hubs. These systems are not just digital. They need, a cloud actually is a physical space. There are data centers. So how can we give them buildings, give them shape, and give it character in a more traditional urban design way, give them form within our city. So that's all that. Then there's even the next level, thinking at the scale of architecture. Obviously, we listed all these kind of spaces. These labs, research facilities are not your normal office spaces or housing spaces. They have very serious requirements for what they need in terms of ventilation,
我们需要保证非常好的通风条件，去很好的利用污水、雨水，如何更集约化的利用空间，如何做到各方面元素的相对统一。
make that much more generous and wide,
如
and
何
how that could allow for the current systems to come in for ventilation, movement,
处理
things
好
like
街
that.
道的关系，能够
But
让
also that core would be wide and generous enough that over time it could be
所以我
adapted
们
and
就想到
changed.
了可以
We've
更
seen
加
like the
充分的利
infrastructure
用
under
空
a
间的
road
垂直分
could be
区功
adapted
能，
easily to
这
allow
样
for
我
new
们就可以
systems to
把
come
重
in
要
as
的
we
科
get
技
new
企业集
technologies
中到这
in
个
the
核
future.
心上，也可以把更
You
多
can
的
see
高
the
科
kind
技
of
系统应用
architectural
到整
forms
个建
here,
筑里。
how they manifest themselves, some more
这
expressive,
里
some a
呢
bit
有
more
一些我
normative.
们所使用的
And how do you deal with
建筑
building
类型着
skins?
眼，
All
有一
this,
些比
again,
较
this is not an
繁
architectural
琐，有一些比
presentation,
较
so I
简
won't go into
单。
that too much.
简洁大
But
方，
how
我
these
们不
spaces
会
lay out
对
is all
此进
part
行
of
过
the
多的展
urban
开。
and how they lead to a series of urban characters and spaces.
我们也可以对建筑的正侧面设计进行思考，让它更多的去体现城市的特征。
Now, getting to what for us
现
in
在
some ways was what we saw as the icon of the project. How do
我
we
们也
think
看
about
到了
the
整
public
个
space, the
设
space where
计
people can
的
come together? Of
标志
course,
性
the
的地
quality of
区，
your lab and your house is really
我们如
important.
何去
The
建
place where you meet other
这些自然
other
的园
workers
区，如
and
何
other
完成
people.
这个建筑的设
And so
计。
then it wasn't even about people again. Sorry to talk about
但是
nature
这
so
些
much,
其实都
but
是跟人相关的，
this area isn't just important
而
in
我
terms
们
of
不
water,
应
it's
该
also in
仅
terms of
仅
animal
的
habitat.
限制于
For
我们
migrating bird
对
species,
于
the
人
Shenzhen
类
River
活
is
动的考
incredibly
虑，我们
important,
也要
and the
考虑
client
到
was
自
taking
然
it
的
quite
一些
seriously.
要求，
So how
比
do we
如水
create
资源，
habitats for these
那么
migrating
如
birds,
何
and
更
how
好
can
的利
that
用
be
水
dealt
资
with?
源，如何更好的与
Also,
鸟
we
类
saw our
给鸟
project
类
as a big
创
push
设
as
更
a
良
quote
好的生
innovation
存
delta. So we
空
really
间。
took the Futian River,
我
that
们整
previously was
体的
diverted
设计
around the
就
site,
是创
and
造
brought
这个
it
创
into
新
the
的三角
site to
洲，
create a
可以
delta,
把福江河
a
这些
wetland
引
area,
流
really
将其
on
引
the
入到
site.
园区之中，
So
充
of
分利
course we
用水
needed
资
to take
源。
care of all
当
the
然，我们
basics
还
of
有
how
一
you
个
move around the
难点，就
site,
是
the
如何
buses,
把
delivery
自行车、
vehicles,
公共
bikes,
汽车、行
walking
人系统
networks.
等
These
等
had to be
有
there.
机的与这个设计
And
结
we
合
had to
起来。
compile them all together
我
along
们
with
可
the
以把
bases
它
of
们
buildings to
都组合
create
到一
this
起，
kind of what
能
we
够
saw as
和
an
我
iconic
们的办
public
公
space form
地
at the
区
ground.
完
You
美
can
的
see
结
kind of
合，
in the
形成一个
visual
地标
here.
式的建筑。
This idea that the wet spaces to the green spaces to the base of the buildings
那比如
all
说
speak
湿地，比
together
如说绿
to
化，比如
create a
说
kind of
园
cohesive
区，
green
整个
campus
设计
amongst
为
this
一
very
个非
urban
常好
setting.
的集
So
约
that
的
meant
园
when
区
we
系
think
统，
about
也是
bringing
我
in the
们
Futian
的想
River,
法。
that meant we had to deal with cleaning the river and
但是
all
提
the
到了对福
habitats
江
and
河进
requirements
行
of
引
filtering that
流，
come with
就
that,
意味着我们
the
也
types
要
of
对水资
plants
源
and
进行处
technologies
理，
you need
如
to
何保
deal
持
with
它
those
的
sort of
清洁，
systems
如何对
and those
其
sort of
进行处
realities.
理。这也是我们面对的
And
现
that
实。
allowed us also to think about how we could create a series of smaller
这也就让我们
natural spaces with a
继
diverse
续考
series of
虑如
characters so
何
that
创设一系
people
列
could have a different
更
series
小
of kind
的
of courtyard
生态
experiences
方
within
面
it.
的小的结
So
构，
some of
去
the
帮助
spaces
我
were
们
seen
处
more
理
as
这
an
些生
urban
态问题。
plaza. Some were
中间
seen
可
as
能会有一
much
些
more
城市的
rest and
广
natural
场，
based, kind of a zen
那
or
有人也
rest
会比
garden
较
as
关注
described
一些
here,
可以休息的地方。
and how those are obviously planted and dealt with in terms of the
我们
movement
如
of
何把这
water,
些装置
rainwater,
能够
people
更好的
moving,
和生
and
态
how these
去
could
进
all
行
work
连
together.
接，如何实现
Generating
人们
an
对生
example,
态、对
something
自然
like this,
的
where you see the
了
high
解。
tech sort of green
这些都
buildings
可以
above
通过
and
我
this very
们使
naturalistic
用高
setting
科技技
of
术，把
almost
绿化
river or creek
方面的
like
考虑
experience.
和城市的建设进行一个组合。
Whereas other areas feeling much more urban. This is actually a pool,
有些地方可能
kind of a
更为城
play,
市化。那像我们图
playful
中
pool
展示
space
的
on the right
就
with a
是一
series
个有
of
水有
buildings
湖的
I
地
won't get
方，
into the details of in the distance. So
也
this
就是我
artificial
们
beach,
通
as
过
it's
高
labeled,
科技
and how
将
they all come together
人
along the
工的
Shenzhen
组
River,
合与
facing
生
towards
态
Hong
进行
Kong,
充分的
to
结
create a
合，
series of spaces to overlook the river and to play and
创造 造出这么一个空间，我们既能看见自然的水资源，也可以充分的利用城市化带给我们的便利。
And about how we can think about a more urban idea of public space, not just for the birds and the plants and for
另外一方面，
nature.
我们也不能忽略人们对便捷性的要求，不能仅仅去考虑水资源和鸟类迁徙，因为 这些生活中比较常见的服务，比如说在哪吃饭、在哪书记，对于我们每日的员工的每日生活也是非常重要的。当然，也就涉及到了一些道路方面的设计和规划。
much more
比如
colorful,
说体育
place
大
where you can
道
play ping pong,
可能
basketball,
会
maybe
颜
tennis
色比较
actually
多
in the
样，
street.
这样我们就
You
可
could
以
go
随时
jogging
去
on
进
the
行
elevated
徒
pathway.
步锻炼，在这
And
个大
these would
道
all
上
kind of
慢
connect
跑，
together in these series of spaces, like you can see here.
和人们
This
进行
mixing of
交流。
perhaps a few restaurants or entrances to
路
offices,
边可能会有
but
一些餐
spaces
馆，
mostly devoted to sport and leisure
还
in that
会
regard.
也有
Whereas
更
another
多的
example
空
is
间
this kind of cultural street,
与人们进行
cultural
体育运动。
valley
还有一些
almost,
空间可以给
where
人
we
们
wanted
进
to
行
create this topography
文化的
of
展
green
示。
spaces that could really showcase
这些绿色的
the
部
idea
分
of
可以充分展现
cultural
出
expressions, maybe even show some of
我
the
们想体
innovations
现的
coming
文化
in
展
the
示。
area, some relics of what has happened
比如
previously
说
in
有一些遗
Shenzhen,
据
in
之前
spaces
深
of
圳发生
sculpture,
过什
and
么，
mix them all in together
城
into
市
this
的一
space
些
again
标
that
志性的
looks
建筑，
towards Hong Kong
这
and
些
the
都可
connection
以
between these two
充分
cities.
的在我们的设计
And
中
then
展现出。
finally, an
那么最
urban
后呢，
boulevard down the middle or central spine.
我们的中轴主街，
So this connective tissue, we saw it really as a food street, of course. In this part of the
我们
world,
会
food
看
is
到这些
incredibly
分布的
important,
地
a
方
place to
也
gather.
会
But also
展
a
示了
place,
一些
maybe I
进
work
行
in one building,
我们可
my
以就
friend
餐
works in another tech company across the
或者
way.
休息的地方。
But we wanted to maybe get together at lunch or maybe in
我
the
们也
afternoon
许
or
会
maybe
在
in the
不同
evening
的
and
地方
talk.
工作，
So to create
但
a
是
series
中
of
午
small
班的时候或者
pavilions,
晚
small
班的时候，
spaces
可
where
能
we
希
can
望
meet,
聚一
mingle,
聚
talk
进
business,
行聊
talk
天。
other things.
那么这些区
How
域
these
对
could
于我
happen
们进行
along
交
this
流是非常重要
main
的，
street.
而且
And
能
you
够
can
让
see
我
an
们
image here of some
非常
self-driving
方便的到
buses,
达。
bike lanes, and all that, framing on a
在这
very
条街
linear
上可能有不
space,
同的分区，
cutting
就比
through
如
the
说
site,
无人驾驶汽
bonding
车行
everyone
驶的地
together.
方、行人行驶的地
You
方，
can see the
以
overall
及
image here. This is
骑车人
looking
去
north
行驶
from
的地
Hong
方。
Kong, and you can
向
start to
北，
see how
在
this
这个街
comes
上向
together
北，
in
我
a
们可以
series
看
of
到香
gestures
港。
that are both cohesive, but a bit of a
在这条
playful
街上
public
行走，我
space.
们又能看到许多非常显眼的、显著性的标志。
Okay, to think a bit bigger,
那么我们在
this
想
obviously
大一
brings
点
up
的
the
项
idea of
目，
smart city and
这也
these sort
就
of
给我
notions
们
that we
带来
talk
了
about
智
every
能
day,
城市
big
的概
data
念，
and how they relate. And
以及
when we talk about
把
those, we
这
really
个
talk
城
about
市
them
和大
within
数据进
urban
行连
places,
接。
within extremely urban places,
我
and
们
how
刚
they
才
can
讨论的这些
optimize
地区，基本
cars,
上都是城市化的地
make
区，
buses more
有非常
efficient,
先进的
environmental
汽
systems,
车
a lot
系
of the
统，
things I talked about in the last
也
project.
可以让我们
But
未
we
来的
start to
生
think
活
about how
交通
cities are
更
really
为方
different
便。
now.
那我们
Cities
也来
aren't
讨论一
just
下，
a
城市
walled
其实
city
是不一
in
样
small
的，
scale.
城市不再是那
They've
种
expanded
城墙
their
相
networks
隔
now.
的城
You
市，
might think of this as
他们其实是
something
往
new,
往
but in reality, this has kind of always been that. You can see
在
it
事
here in
实
an
上
old
在
example
实
of
际上
Europe.
我们也可以
How
看
there's a
到
series of small
欧洲的
villages
一些
connected
例
through a
子，
series of
许多的城市是
urban
非常
networks
紧密
or
相连的，
infrastructures connecting them across. So they're
用
more
基
like
础设施
constellations.
用
More like
基
when you
础
look at
设
the
施
night
进行
sky
了
and you
连
can
接，
imagine how the stars
更
are
像是
connected.
天空中
And also,
的
this is very
星
much true here in
那对于
East Asia.
东亚来讲，这种情况
You
也
can
是
see
存
these
在的。
realities as well. A
大
notion of
家
a
也可以
city
看
is much
到
more of a
这种城
network
市的
and
现实
not
是
just
存在的。
a
这个
traditional
城市
notion
通
of
过
a
基
kind of
础
walled
设施
space.
进行相连，突破
And
了
for
城
us,
墙的
and
界
a
限。
project I'll share here that we're
那
doing
对于我
right
们来
now,
讲，
so
我们现在在做的这个项目，
this is in Lantau.
是在
Lantau Island is as close as you can get to Macau,
也
while
是
still
香
being in
港
Hong
和
Kong, so kind of between Tai O,
香港
historic
和澳
village,
门最近的地
and
区，
between the
但是
Hong
它
Kong
还是香港
airport,
的一个位置，
there is
离
the
着香
Tung O
港
ancient
的机场
trail.
非常近。
And so we're doing a community engagement
我
project
们在这
again
里
in
其
this
实
very
进行了
rural
社区
area.
融合活动。
So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about rural in the last 10 minutes or so of the presentation.
我们在演讲的最后
About
10分钟也来
this
讨论一
community
下
engagement project that
我
we're
们这
doing
种
there
社区融
in
合
along the Tung O ancient
活
trail.
动。
So in this, we brought in the idea of design
我
thinking.
们
Again, not just us doing
把
this,
这
we do
种
it
设
with
计
a
思想
partner, Hong Kong Design Center,
融
as
入
well
到
as
了我
with
们各种活动
Maker
之中。
Bay, which is led by Cesar Harada, who also, like me, teaches at HKU.
伙伴在培养香港大学生的创造性思维、思维给大众，并且获取他们的反馈的一种方式，如何在这种更为广阔的领域，让人们能够接受你的这种思想，并且能够有一种联系度为密切的感觉。比如说，我们可以进行一些采访，但是我们如何把这种社区的联系跨越时间的概念，
涉及到
So
更
you
多
kind
的
of
不
need to
同
kind
群
of
众
almost
呢，
go door to door. It's almost community engagement
这就
hand to
要求
hand
我们可
and
能
really start to get
需
to know
要
the
去
people. And by taking advantage of the
进行
time,
社
and
区
I'll
访
talk
问，
more
去
about
让人
technology,
们
you can
更
start to
多的
engage with
参
people
与
in
到我们
different
的讨论
ways.
中，用不
So
同的方
community
法
engagement is
调动
not
人们
just
参与到我们
dominated
的活动。
by the loudest person that comes to the public meeting and speaks up. And
那
those
比如
people are
说，我们
lovely.
会
I
举行一
actually
些
enjoy
会
them at
旅，
public meetings, don't get me
我们
wrong.
还
But how
非
you
常
can start to get to
我
know
们
some
其
of the
实是
other
非常
people
喜欢这
that
种
are along the way and how we
传
can
统
use
意义
different
上的会
techniques
议，
to engage.
但是我们也需要其
So
他
in
的
more
一些
basic
方式，
ways, kind of
去
mapping and
让更多
meeting,
的人参与
really
到
going
我
out
们
and
的活
discussing
动
with
之
the
中。
public, of course, walking the site, getting to know people over
比
time,
如说进行旅
having a
行，
series of much
去认
more
识更多的人，
touchable maps so they can really
去
feel
了
like
各
the
种
map of
我
their
们可
area
以
they
上
can
手操作的一些地
interact
图，
with,
让
they
他
can
们
play
更多
with, they
的
can add to.
参与
It's much
互
more of an
动，
idea of a gaming in terms of engaging with these
设
places.
计
And you can see
我
where
们
the
也
images
通
are.
过
We
了
could
这
really
种
bring this map
游戏的
to
概念，能够让
their
人们
front
更
yard
多
or
的
to the
去
local kind
参
of
与到这
community
个整个
shed.
过程之中。
And then also bringing
当然
experts
了，
there. So
我
bringing
们也会
environmentalists,
邀请一
bringing
些专
heritage
家、环境
experts in
专
terms of
家、
their
城
knowledge
市
of the
专
area
家，
and
就让他们
allowing them to
村落里，
contribute in terms of the reading of the area,
让他们
traditions,
去贡献自己的力
cultures,
量，
customs, historical
让人们
legacies,
更加了
and start
解
to
文化
understand
遗
those,
产，
as well as environmentalists, of
各项
course,
设
educating
计，
us about maybe special species or habitats or
比
damages
如
that have been
带
done to
领
the
我们
area
认
as
识
it has
更多
developed.
的物种、不同的植被。
And also the economics. One of the challenges is an area like this
当然还有
is
经济方
also
面带来的各种
a
挑
lot of
战。
the more older community still is there, but one of the things they're sad about is a lot of their younger children or grandchildren have moved away because they feel like they can't earn a living in areas like this. So
他
how
们
do
可
we
能
think
希
about
望
the
自己的孩
economics
子能
of
够
the
走出
rural?
社区，不
I
再
know
回
this is
来，因
still
为
Hong
当地
Kong,
的
but
经
to
济
really
可
get
能
from
发展并不是特别的
Tayo
好。
to Central and Hong Kong would take you probably 2 hours or an hour and a half if you're moving fast.
但这个地方可能离
So
距
it's
离
a,
香
it's a
港
really
的中心
dispersed
大概
area.
2个
How do
小
we
时，
think about the economics and
所
potentials
以
in those areas?
它离着香
So
港的
of
中
course
心，
we go through, we talk to people,
对着
we
他们的
collect
基
information,
础设施可能
usual
都
kind
不
of
是特别的
information
发达。
gathering, but then we also come back with that.
思
We
考
see
如
this
何
as
把
an
这些
additive
信息
process
会
of
转化
engaging
为
with
我们
them
可以利用的数
and
据。
how we start to come up with design ideas and test
我
it with
们
them,
如何
very much
去
using the design thinking methodology. So this idea
开
of
发出
games,
新的创意，并
coming
且
with
运用
stickers,
在现实中，
coming with
我们可能
interactive
会用
maps
这种
to kind of
互动
get
的
a reaction from everything as
图、
basic to
互
a
动的便
toilet
携
to
签儿、
something much more
便携
playful like
签儿，
butterflies,
让人们
and really
通
trying to
过
work with the
比较好
community,
玩的形
also
式，
engaging them in drawing. You can
深
see
刻
some
的去体
examples
会到这
here
个过程中。那么这张图里也
where it
展示
wasn't
了
just
人们通过
us
绘画的方
or
式，
the
能
citizens. We
够
actually
把
brought
自
in
己的
artists
一些
and
设
had
计和
them
主
kind of
题
talk to some
现
of the
在绘
people
画
and
之
kind
中。
of sketch with them about what they would like to see in
我
certain
们也会邀
locations
请
and how they
一
could
些
evolve over time.
设计师与人们
But
一起
then I mentioned this idea of
创设
technology. I think this is still not used well
创
enough
设这些
in how
城
we
市
do
的发展
community
地区。
engagement and how we can get better feedback and better interaction and
我们
ultimately
也在
make better
讨论如
connections
何和
between
人们
people
更好的
and the
去交
places they
流，
live.
收集到更有效的
So
信息。
first, we could just
那
use
首
it
先呢，我们
as we make observations ourselves, as the
用
citizens make
这种地
observation,
图
as the
和图
workshop
像的方式进行
participants,
方
as the
向，
experts
进
come,
行分
we
析。
can start to use geotagging to start building up a series of information.
比如
Start
说
to
我们在这张
understand what is there and
地图
document
上体现
that
出不同的
information
地
as a
质
way
信
that
息，
it's open source. The villagers can
而且通
add
过这种
and
开源的信息分享方
comment
式，
on these sort of ideas of what's in their
村民
village.
可以更多
But
的
also
把
we
他
can
们
look
对这些
historically using
游客可以
aerial
把他们
imagery
对这些
mixed with
村落的
historical
理
maps
解
to
或者
start to
感受
better
写到
understand
我们的
why
地图
maybe
上，
the ecology is that way, why the
这样我
heritage
们
is
就
that
可以
way,
更多的去
to
理
really
解
use
这
some
个当地的遗
analysis
产或者当地的
and
一些
build
发
up a
展
sort of series of analytical
这种
maps.
形式
As
的，
I said, we're
我们
about
可以
halfway
更
through the
好的去
process.
分
This
析背
map's
后的
pretty
历史
simple one at
生
this
产
point,
原因。
but we're working more and more towards building up that. But then also using the idea of big
当然
data.
了，我们也会通过大数据分析
And
的
we
方
see
式进
this,
行
of
分
course,
享
I。think, I don't think we're innovators here. We're not Google, we're not Weixin, we're not whatever tech company you think is groundbreaking these days. But we can start to use social media tags, platforms to start to understand where people see more butterflies, where people see more species. And by kind of digging through this, we can get a greater understanding than we ever would as so-called experts or advisors to understand what is going on in the area and be much more aware of even what citizens or tourists value in the area, how they use the space over time, where they take pictures, where they rest. Big data can give us a lot of information even in a rural area, that can help us better understand the community and what it might need or want in the future. And in a really simple way, one of my favorite examples is also the idea of an oral history. Normally, this is maybe written, or maybe not even written, or maybe just recorded. But we actually took a 3D, and we're doing this with a few key heritage members of the community, walking around the site with them and kind of having them tell us about their community.
村民们的生活状态，就比如说，我会邀请他们为我们介绍一些例子，介绍他们
kind of documenting that with a 360-degree camera, walking around and having them tell us about their areas and their habitats. So we have that legacy.
下来他们遗址和遗址的传承。
So, moving to another rural project, I'll talk about an area very briefly. We're doing a project in Ningde, which is up in Fujian province, so basically halfway between Macau and Shanghai. They're typical rural area, very nice. The client who asked us wanted to do high-tech greenhouses, but this is an image of where I used to live in the Netherlands. I know what high-tech greenhouses can be like. They're almost like glass factories. We wanted to talk about how that high-tech green space and food space could come in, but could be much more like a village. And how we could relate spaces of growing food, both on land, in a greenhouse, and living, and mix it together to allow a very new way of living that still relates to the heritage, but provides something new. We created a series of spaces. I won't go into this too much. This leads into something else I want to talk about, to be honest. Now under construction, up in Ningde.
现在这个我们建议他们不要做这种传统的温室，而是通过融合，把这些温室建造成既可以供人们生活，也可以供他们工作的地区，也充分利用地势上的不同分层。这个项目正在建设过程之中。其实这个例子也是我们如何看待城市，如何把城市的特征和一些新引入的概念进行结合的方式。所以我们可以看到人们以不同的方式，更多的去了解生态，通过这些高科技，就比如说无人机。比如说，卫星这类都可以为我们提供和人眼看到的信息不太一样的方面。我们为这家公司所做的项目，其实就是辅助他们能够以不同的方式去观测自然。
But also allow the participants to really look at the nature much more closer, to even see how nature exists, maybe even underground. But to also understand how movement is shaped by the buildings and nature on site, how heat exists in the city simultaneously, is the way we can see the city differently. And this leads to the last bit. We have an Institute for Autonomous Urbanism that I have with a friend of mine, David Lee, technology gentleman. And we talked about this emerging difference, not just in terms of smart cities, but thinking about it differently in terms of how we can think about how we live in our cities, not just in terms of technology, but how it affects space. So in that, I mean, is what I call dispersed infrastructure that we all are aware of. Traditional infrastructure was roads, pipes, trains. It was big. It was owned by either the government or large corporations. It's very expensive. Nowadays, infrastructure is solar, energy cells, even the idea of collecting rainwater out of the air, self-driving cars, even just your phone. We all have a phone that's actually part of infrastructure. There's information technology on there, but I own my phone. So it's this agreement between me, the citizen, corporation,
但是对于我们每个人来讲，我们也是可以拥有自己的个人的基础设施，比较小。就比如说，我们可能会用手机获取到不同的信息。我们作为公民，也需要和机器进行一个非常好的交互。我们可以在大湾区的一些工厂看到。我们如何有些工作是由人来完成的，有些工作其实是由机器来完成的。在阿里巴巴的仓库，我们可以看到，这个仓库本身就像大城市一样，很多的工作都是用机器来完成的。 那么在非洲的一些地区，可能人们就在想，我们不要去建设公路，而是用无人机或者其他的一些设备为我们监控当地的农作物发展等等。我们之前也提到过这个苗圃的概念。这些地区我们可以获取到植物，我们也可以把苗圃挪到我们的公园这个概念之中。这样我们可以用无人机去监测它们是否得到了足够的阳光、足够的水分。这些观点、这些诠释都会对于我们住在城市里，让城市更为人性化，带来非常多的建议和帮助。那么我们之前也有一个非常有名的艺术家，他也提到过，湾区的街道是给驴走的，非常直的街道是给人类进行创造的。那这句话就是，城市其实是由走在上面的物品所决定的。就像我们在大湾区，我们也可以看到，经常忽略到大量的货物如何通过商船进行运送，也会影响到我们在深圳、香港、澳门地区的形态以及整个世界。我们不要忽略简单的船体居然可以对整个的经济带来如此大的影响，塑造着世界贸易和经济模式。我们也可以看到，其实这些小型的设备真的能够影响我们整个城市的布局。40年间，深圳发展的变化真的是令人瞩目。这是一个本地的例子，可能不是特别新，但是就比如我们在曼哈顿的城市的变化，之前我们可能没有电梯，没有公路，没有汽车，但是随着我们这几项发明的出现，曼哈顿不断的成长，形成了现在的这个非常摩登的形式，非常现代的形式。当然，这个在深圳和澳门也是出现了同样的一个现象。我们还有最后一个例子，是我在荷兰教书的时候，在一个非常小的荷兰城市，我们就提到了这个无人驾驶汽车的潜力。事实上，它就很像一个出租车。
it's going to be like a taxi, well, that means the cars don't need to go on every road. I can walk a block and a half to get the self-driving car. So that means we can take the cars off a lot of those roads. So these roads can be for cars, but that leaves these smaller scale roads that can be used for something different. They no longer need to be for cars. They can be for many other things. If you know the percentage of cities, most cities,
但是如果我们去考虑整个城市的这个比例
，even just half of that, that means that's 20% of cities that we need to completely rethink about how we use that space. For simple illustration, this is just a very normal street in Eindhoven, very classic Dutch. Nothing exciting. If you say, what are we going to do with that space now that cars don't need to be there, we don't need parking, we don't need to allow people to drive there anymore? What could that be? How could we start to talk to citizens? Can we think about community spaces, play spaces, green spaces, gardens? All sorts of things could happen in that area. And so this sort of thinking is what we think about in terms of how these small-scale technologies, something like a self-driving car, for example, can really transform our cities, not just giving us a different form of taxi or more efficient buses, or these systems. These can really change the spaces we live in, and we as designers, landscape architects need to really start thinking about what this means. Okay, that's it for me. I'm happy to hear any and all questions. Thank you for listening.
非常感谢大家，这是我的演讲部分就完成了，就完成了。如果大家有问题，我们可以进行交流。
Wow, can you guys hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason. Thank you for presenting such an informative and inspiring projects, covering many areas from a macro scale design down to micro scale projects of community engaged landscape design and some installation works. Not only that, I'm impressed with the works that was presented, but you managed to present like 200 plus slides in such a short time. Well done to that. But jokes aside, coming back to your ideology of a formal armature, it's an approach that can be clearly seen in your works, obviously. But how would you describe the importance of such concept or of a formal armature in your design works?
I mean, in a basic way, what we mean by formal armature is we think us spatial designers, whatever you want to call landscape architects, urban designers, we all need to be more aware and more conscious of how we may have been taught to really think about design in a very formal, very spatial way.
以空间的方式去进行思考，但事实上，不仅仅是这些空间的正式概念，还会有很多基础设施啊或者网络这些概念会对于我们整体的设计产生影响。因此，我们需要考虑各种不同的系统，包括科技系统、自然系统、各种不同的工具如何去充分的应用。
But to be very conscious of those
这些都对于我们的空间利用和设计会非常的有益。
that we can't just ignore. That's something we need to really start to engage with and see not as a hindrance or a problem,
不能把它们作为一个阻碍或者问题，而是把它作为一个机会。我们一定要去抓住这些机会。
Or start to think about how traffic movements work and have a different conversation
比如
with
说
traffic
交通
engineers. You can really reshape our cities in a way
改造我们
that
的
is something we just need to get better at understanding these systems and how they can be used to improve and not just see these, oh, I just want to design objects, get all this stuff out of my way, and I'll make my really beautiful street or building or cool art. So that's what I mean by the idea of this informal
I mean, that's really interesting. Because we can really relate it back to Macau. Macau being a city of a strong historical background, despite of its size. I think the urban development can reflect clearly like a conjunctive symbiosis of a top-down rational planning approach and a bottom-up spontaneous growth. And especially if you go to the historical part of Macau, you can find like a very organic layout that embodies like the city's culture and coexistence between like Chinese and Portuguese communities, and down to the like the new areas where it's all like gridded and urban planning. You know? So I guess like my question for you is, like, next question is like what is your view on such of an interesting coexistence of the urban fabric in Macau? And how would you foresee the future planning of Macau based on your idea of a formal armature?
Well, I mean, I think Macau is super fascinating because it is this small place, and like you said, this coexistence of kind of mega capitalism, casino, architecture, and urban development next to heritage, next to colonial realities. I think it's not just a Macau thing, to be honest. I think you see it in other places. And of course, me, as someone interested in cities, I love that stuff. I like that you feel that moment when you're like, hey, someone changed the plan, or this is a different era, or the guy or girl that did this over there didn't like that guy or girl over there, or they were from centuries different. So I like that ability to read a city and understand its kind of heritage and its history and its urban form. And I think regular citizens start to see that. And you see it also, I think, in a place like Hong Kong has that as well. You know, you can see a moment where you're like, oh yeah, this was built in the 60s. You know, they really thought that was great. Or you go to other areas and you see something different. When I lived in Rotterdam, it also had that as well. Rotterdam was always this kind of nice joke Netherlands because it was bombed by the Nazis in World War II, so it's flattened. But all the rest of the Netherlands is flattened. So it was all heritage and beautiful and Amsterdam and these things. Rotterdam was a playground. So all these fancy Dutch architects could, one neighborhood was what they thought was cool in the 70s, one neighborhood was cool what they thought in 1985. And so really, some people describe it kind of a history of urban planning failures was a nice tour I took of it. But so you can see these different ideologies and experimentations, and I really liked that diversity. And then also, because I do actually quite like this question, I would say two people have written about it that I really like on that. One was a book called Collage City by Colin Rowe.
曾经有一本书叫做《城市的冲击》。
idealistic notion that there's a singular best city is false. Cities are collages of different neighborhoods. Whether, you know, in the West that might be something like Chinatown, or maybe another neighborhood was designed by more of a modernist.
因为在中国，我们也会看到许多的冲击，就比如说有些地方是由现代的设计家进行设计的，古建筑，这些都会重复的存在。
But I actually really like complexity and contradiction.
但事实上，我是非常喜欢这种复杂性和冲击性的。但许多建筑可能也会有历史的一些遗存。而另外一些建筑可能经历了不同的历史、不同的一些状况。
But in reality, like when you design a phone, you have one end that maybe you don't showcase as much as a designer's because there's certain realities, and another that's more the show, and another that's a different reality. So even in our buildings, I think you can read that to understand these sort of things. So I think that's a huge opportunity. In a place like Macau, yeah, I think these singular design cities, like I've been to Shanghai and places like that, you know, that were one design, a great master plan. Sometimes they're boring because it feels like it's all figured out, but this kind of clashing together, this reading of the history of a city, like you can see in a place like Macau, and the diversity that is in a place like Macau is actually just much more exciting. So it's not just about the food, which is great, but you can actually see it in the city itself. And so I think those differences aren't to be fixed, but celebrated. That was a long-winded answer to your good question, but yeah.
Exactly. Like it has to be a balance between like a formality and informality. You know? And when you mentioned about like big data, which I really agree on that part, because it's really important that you use like available materials or information to inform the design process. And at the end of the day, we are designing for the community and the context. And as architects, urbanists, or designers, whatever you like to call them, it's important that we are sensitive on this matter, understanding the context and the culture. So really agree on that. All right, so let's see. We do have a few questions from the audience. And there's one. I'll just read out the question, and Jason, if you could answer to that. The first question is, do you find there's a great difference between American urban context and Greater China urban context?
和大中华区的城市环境有着非常大的区别。
Is there a difference between the American urban context and the Chinese or East Asian urban context?
美国可能就是美式的一种环境大中华区可能反映的是东亚的城市的这些文化。这是一个非常有趣的问题。当然，这也就取决于你是怎么理解这个 America 的概念，是美洲还是美国？但是我觉得这里可能讲的应该是美国。
The Americas, getting at kind of related to Macau, you know, there's cities that were French cities, there's cities that were Dutch cities.
美国其实更像澳门，因为它是一个非常复杂的区域，可能有法国，可能有法国的殖民或者不同地方的殖民，而且美国是一个非常新的国家。 很多的城市其实是为了汽车而建的。
American cities in terms of how they exist, how people move, and so I think that's very different.
的一个非常重要的概念。
And in a place like East Asia, there's a lot more
对于东
history.
亚
I
来
mean,
讲，
there
可
was
能
history in
城
America. Let's
市
be clear.
更多的
Us
去
white
显
guys
示的
that
是
showed
历
up
史的
basically
一
killed all
些
those people and destroyed
是
their
历史
cities.
文化的一些
But in terms of the contemporary urban form,
在现在的这个城市规划、城市形态来
it
讲，
is what it is. Whereas here,
也就成为了
things have much more
这些
layers and much more
条件
history.
可能
But on the other hand,
让
I mean, they're
亚
very
洲的
related.
这些城市
You can maybe
的层
disagree
次
with
更
me,
加
but to me, this
丰富。您可能
feels
对于我
like
的
this
观
kind
点
of
并不是非常的
global
认同。
tradition of how to make cities has evolved here. I think the Europeans kind of exported a model to the States and the Americas, and then
更
we
像
played
是
around with
其
it
实
and came
更
up with
像是
something weird
欧
that
洲
is
把这种城市的概
American
念引
urban
进到了美
form.
国
And I think
而
when a
美
lot
国
of
就
East
套用了
Asia
这种
decided to think
形
about how
式
to build their cities in the last 50 years,
并且呢
a
也
lot
在
of
过
those
去
people maybe
50
went to
年
school
间
in the
去
United
思考自己
States
的方式。
and maybe saw those cities as successful models, so kind of brought it here to
中
Asia,
国
but
这
then
些
it
城
also
市
took on its own
会
character.
觉得美
So I
国在
think
过去
when I
40
walk around
年的
places like
发展
Hong
是非
Kong
常
or
令人瞩
Shenzhen
目
or
的，
Shanghai,
并且把这种
I
模式
also
套
see
用到
kind
了
of
自己的
a
城市建设
reinterpretation
之中。
of
比如说
American
香港
urbanism.
啊、
So it's
深
all
圳
kind of
啊
tied
这些
together,
地
but
区，
no,
我
there's
都能看到
definitely a
美国
huge
的城市发展的一
difference
些影
in terms
子
of。urban form, but still so many common threads because it's the
所以呢，
education
这
is
就
not
导
necessarily
致着
just regional.
美
A
国
lot
和
of the
中国可
people
能会遇到
who had
许多相
ideas
似的
in the
危险。
West back in the day were stealing them from the East, and that's how they started to make cities and architecture there. And now you see that sort of borrowing going in all sorts of directions. So
其实两
yeah,
方
I
都
hope
会
that's
I guess it's that variation
抄袭了谁的
in
城市
the
发展模式。
urban development, whereby in Greater China, perhaps you can see like a lot of like coexistence of old villages along, and you have like new cities just built around it. You know, that sort of coexistence, and even like with
我
perhaps
们
like
其实有很多
temples
这种共
and
存
the
的形式
traditional
会体现
items, they're
到
all
不同
mixed
的城市之
together.
中。
You know, and
这种
on the
形
other
式
hand,
其
you
实
have like
都是混合在
cities
一
which
起
are
的。
really well developed.
另一方面，
Perhaps
你
like
会有一些
what you
城市
said,
非常的发展
relating
非
back
常的好，
to the Dutch is like a
就比如说
playground where people can experiment
有一
on
些
different
荷兰的
architecture.
模式， 这些地区可
I
能会有
think
一些
oh,
游乐
you going
园
to the next question? Please go ahead.
Yeah. Just the next question.
那么
How
我
do
们
you
下一个问
see
题就是
public space playing a
您是
part in
如
Hong
何
Kong's
看待这
future
个公
urban
共
and
的
social
空间
context?
在城
Urban and
市
social
香港
context.
的城市和社
All
会
right.
扮演的
How
角
do I
色？
see public space in terms of how it relates to Hong Kong's future? Well, obviously, it's been a very interesting year.
今年
Not
也是
just in
非
terms of
常
the
有趣
virus,
儿的，
but the protests that
不仅
happened in
仅
Hong
是
Kong.
因为这个疫情
And
的
so
影
it's been
响，
an
还
extremely
有
interesting
在
year
香港
here.
进行
I'm
的这
obviously
个
not from here. I've only
抗
been in
议。
Shenzhen and Hong Kong the last 5 years. It's been very
在过
educational
去
for
5
me
年中，其实我一直
with
在
my
深圳
staff,
和
with
香
my
港之间
students,
流动，
and a lot of my students are mainland
不仅仅是
or
我的
from
员工，
Macau,
还
so
有
they
很
have
多的
different
学
readings
生。
of what's happened here. And obviously,
所
public
以我们
space
对
is
于香港
incredibly
发生的这
important
些
in
事情
relation
都
to
是
the
非常
virus
关注的。
and into notions of what is public space and what it means for
当然，我们
citizens.
也要去思考
What
公
does it
共
mean in the
空间
future?
是什么意思，对于未来有什么影响？
Well, I think what I will say that I thought was extremely
我对于
interesting
这个问题的看
about
法
what
来讲，
happened in Hong Kong
航空
was actually if you
香港发
saw
生的事件还是
this
非常
notion of what
值
is
得人们
public
去
and
关注
private
的。
gets really interesting here.
因为
Because these
不管是
elevated
私人空
walkways
间还是公
that
共
are
空间，
public
这里的
lead
分
into
界就
shopping
变得非
malls,
常的
which are atriums,
敏感。
which are kind of public, but they're not. And then train stations underground are public, but the MTR can close them. And so this idea, and it's not just a Hong Kong thing, so I think it relates, but for me, it's really emblematic or symbolic of a bigger need.
这是
In
一
the
个
West,
非
there's
常
this idea of, the building comes down to the ground and the thing behind it
对
is
于
private and the thing in front of
西
it is a
方
street and it's
人来
public.
讲，
And so it gives a very clear
室内可
definition
能
of
是这个
government,
私人的空间，
private.
然后室外
But
可能就
here,
是
it's a three-dimensional
公共
city.
空间。
A
但
lot
是
of the protesters
在这
used
来
the
讲，
shopping
可
malls
能
to
是
do
一个三
protests
维
because
的
they
城
felt
市。
safer there because they knew the developer was more friendly to their desires than the government. I'm not saying anyone's right or wrong, but this illustrates the complexity of
政府来讲更为的
what
友好。
even is public space space, who has what agenda, and so the kind of interconnected or blurriness or three-dimensionality of it here, I think is very exciting. and very challenging to kind of who owns public space, who has the right to public space, and then getting at a conversation we had before into that last thing I mentioned. If we think about data and government and infrastructure, government before always had to exist for public space because I pay my taxes, they in theory take care of it, and they give me. But in the area of big data and information, my ability to tell the government what I want to happen in that public space, and me as a series of neighbors can get together and vote or speak to what we would like to happen. This notion of empowerment or of collective can be reinterpreted than just the government is over there and I'm over here. We can much more communicate. That's not just a Hong Kong thing, that's everywhere. But I think this is something I see as exciting about the notions of public space. It's not just public or private. It starts to become much more of a notion of a series of collectives.
Interesting. And you mentioned about like 2020 is a year to forget. We do have a question from our audience. Obviously related to COVID-19, it does change the way we live. So how would you suggest we plan and design in the future? It's going to change a lot of things. I remember, I think in your slide, you had a slide that really talked about that one, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, the COVID question, as somebody who likes public space and really likes density, is always funny. Because a lot of my so-called urbanists back in the United States are now saying how great places like the rural or suburbs are because they're better, they're less dense. Less people around means less virus. I don't think it's that simple. I think in reality, in a very urban place, in a very dense place, you can share information, you can get access to good medical, you can also inform the population a lot better. So I think, for me, COVID and the virus just illustrates the necessity to be able to share information really fast. And to do that in places like public space, because I think the places that have been the most successful with dealing with the virus are very transparent governments that told the citizens really quick what to do, and the citizens could react. So that ability to inform each other really quickly, I think is extremely important. There's certainly very strong-handed governments that have been successful. There's certainly really open-ended governments that have been successful. But the idea of sharing information is incredibly valuable. What that means for the city, I think that for me gets at that last thing. I don't pretend to have the answer. I know I don't like when people say it means we should all be less dense. I do think it means in terms of buildings, we need to think a lot better about our systems and how we ventilate and things like that. In public space, also how we are informed and how much space we're given. I think that's maybe the most exciting thing is I don't see it here in Hong Kong, but I see images in Europe and the United States where basically they're saying, hey, our bars and restaurants can't survive. And we need to have more space, so they start to take over the sidewalk and the streets. And as a Hong Konger, by the way, I loved, this was like a year and a half ago, one of the architects based in Macau was over at HKU for a review. And he invited a few of us Hong Kong architects to come over. And one of the more arrogant Hong Kong architects said, why would I come to Macau? And then I loved my Macau architect friend. He said, yeah, you guys have density, but we actually have like public spaces where you can eat and enjoy and hang out. In Hong Kong, you always have to go in the mall and go to the third floor. And I was like, oh, that's good.
Line up all the time.
Yeah.
So I think this idea of how public space needs to be more adaptable, how we need to be able to occupy it and use it more for humans. So we do need more space, but maybe that doesn't mean suburbs, but it does mean that streets And public spaces need to be allow more crowds.
公共基础设施也会让人们允许人们能够更多的去。
That comes a lot. And again, I get obsessed with these streets. I think streets need to think about how they can be used at different times. We design all these streets for the peak hour of cars.
其实我对于这种公共的设计是非常失望的。
But in reality, a lot of our streets could just be really lovely markets or places to walk or play with our kids at night. You don't just need to be for that car all the time in terms of how we design them.
也不一定说是
That's definitely a hard one, you know, especially in a high density populated city. Like it's definitely something that as designers or architects we need to really think about.
And
due to the shortage of time, we only have one last question left.
当然，因为我们的时间关系，我们只有一个非
From
常简略的
our
问题。
audience, you introduced the project in Shenzhen about the
介绍了
ecological
深圳的
corridor.
一个生态廊道的项目，
design in
我们
Chinese
也
planning
看到了
system.
中国其
Some are
实
pretty direct
中有绿
to
色的
manage ecological corridors. Some, when interpreted into urban area, are only tree
廊
line
道，有
roads.
些
What
呢
do you
就
think
是
of that?
城市区域只有绿树成荫的道路，您对此是怎么看？
That's extremely true. Not just in mainland
其
China,
实是非
a
常
lot of
的真
places.
实的，不仅仅是中国大陆，其
Urban
实
planners,
很多地区
landscape
是这
architects,
样。
politicians
那
just
城
kind of
市的
draw a
这
green
些
line
设
down
计
a
者，
road.
或
Say
者政
ecological
客，他们
corridor.
就在路上画过一片绿色区域，就觉得这是生态廊道了。
It's well, there's no simple answer to that. I mean, it's tough. I mean, if you're doing a master plan and it's something new, I think we're much more informed about how we can think about ecological corridors. When we start to think about the reality and retrofitting them into our cities, it's not so simple. But really, just a tree-lined street can make a huge difference. There's actually a new strain of ecology that's really said, hey, let's quit just looking at pure nature. Let's acknowledge that actually cities are a place where a lot of innovative ecology happens because birds and rats and things have to get inventive, and the trees and bugs start hanging out, and actually new species emerge. So I think we need to be more aware of a diverse reading of what is ecology.
所以我们要对生态进行一个非常好的规划，非常深刻的去理解。
No, I mean, yeah, the green hype is both good and dangerous because it becomes
这可能非常的 是件好事，
but I think the
但也可能
awareness
是
of
非
the
常
importance
危
of
险的事情。
these corridors is really exciting
重
that
要
at
的一
least we're
点是
interested
这
in
个
it.
生态廊
And
道
I
是
think we
非
need to get
常
a whole lot better about it.
非常
But a
好
nicely
的一个
designed
概
tree-lined
念，我们
street
也
can
要
really make a big
这个
difference
概
in
念
terms of an ecological corridor. Would it be
保持
better
接
if
受
it was 400 meters wide and had the right species of water? Sure.
那是不是我们
I mean, I guess we just have to start somewhere, you know, and improvise during the process just to create a better environment.
Exactly, because I mean, the old systems diagrams, all we looked at was how cars moved through. But now people start to think about air. How do the plants move through? How does water move through? We can't just stick it in pipes. So even just the diagrams we draw of how things move through the city before was just us humans, and that was it. And now we start to have to embrace the complexity, and that's overwhelming, but also exciting. But we need to get a whole lot better.
And the community engagement, the idea of community engagement will slowly come into place as well, since all information, as you said, mentioned previously, on big data becomes available. So government will start to analyze using these information and create a better environment.
Absolutely. Some of the most exciting big data is these birders, these people who go out and just obsessively look at birds and put all sorts of pictures. Those guys and girls are great. And suddenly you're like, that bird's in our city? That bird, it's here now? Like, that means it's migrating. And suddenly that just, yeah, the big data, the potential of what it means, we all use it to know where to eat at the good restaurants. But in terms of what it means for our cities as people interested in government is really
Yeah, so I think it's very good. At least we're starting somewhere, and then we need to always, go in a circle, analyze all the concept, and then go back to whether it really fits the current community. And with the COVID question, it's like it feels like we have to keep chasing the technology. We have to run, we have to keep chasing, and architecture just never stops. Very interesting presentation. From nature to animal habitat to community interaction to technology. Yeah, we're gonna keep running. Well, thank you, Jimmy and Jason, and I'm sure we can not stop the Q&A for tonight if we continue. So to all the attendees, if you still have questions and would like to ask Jason, shoot us an email, shoot AAM an email. We can gather all that, and I'm sure Jason will be happy to reply us all. So thank you again, Jason. Very, very interesting. And we will wrap up for the night.
Thank you to our two interpreters, Jordan and Emma.
Great interpreters. They must be very tired, especially Q&A.
The infrastructure, the interpreters are the infrastructure of this. But yeah, thanks again. I look forward to seeing you guys in person in Macau. And those of you out there that I can't see at all, feel free to get in touch. I'd be happy to connect with folks.
We'd definitely love to invite you to come over and then to do a face-to-face presentation. All right. Thank you all. And just a kind reminder, we have an architectural competition, design competition for the Mongha concept. So last day of registration is Friday. So good luck to all of you and look forward to see your submission. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
非常感谢大家。
Thank you.